We've heard revelations that Russia could be developing some kind of nuclear weapon that would be in space, an anti-satellite weapon. In some ways, though, Russia just doesn't matter in space.
Hello, freedom-loving people, and welcome to another episode of the Restricted Handling Podcast. Glenn is back from his trip over to Eastern Europe, which I think we'll talk about at another time. But this time we are joined by Clayton Swope, who is an expert in all things space-related. And this is U.S., China, Russia competition, deterrence, as it pertains to what goes on in the space field, Space Force in particular, which I think we'll dig into. Currently Deputy Director of Aerospace Security Project at CSIS, as well as a Senior Fellow for Defense and Security at CSIS.
And you said my last name right, too, so thank you, Ryan. You didn't even ask, so I really appreciate that. Sometimes people say Swope.
Swope, all right, yeah. I know what it's like. Fugit is a hard one, so I can appreciate it.
You've been there, yeah.
I've been there. I live there.
You're there every day.
You and Clayton know each other from the past. Can you just give people an idea of where you two met and the friendship there?
Yeah, thanks for co-hosting this, Ryan. It's great to see you, Clayton. Thanks for taking time with us today, and hello to all our viewers and followers. Clayton and I worked together overseas in a very exotic place, we'll say. Clayton was one of the rock stars where we were, and we have been friends ever since. I'll let him talk a little bit about his background, but we've stayed in touch ever since then, and I've spoken to him about this, the issue of space issues and other issues, national security issues, since retiring many times, and it's great to have him on the podcast.
Yeah, I think it's really cool what you guys are doing here. I love the name of it. If I ever start a brewery, I'm going to call it Sources and Methods, and I think that kind of goes along with restricted handling. So, maybe we can pair up at some point.
Yes.
I think this podcast and a beer are probably a good combination.
We'll do a collab.
Let's invest in that. When you're ready, Clayton, let us know. I love that.
It's
I've
a good
always
name,
wanted to have a brewery.
It's not a bad name.
Yes.
Sources and Methods.
I love it. Yeah, Clayton, could you just expand a little bit on your background, specifically in the space domain? And just for the listeners, we've wanted to talk about space for so long. We talk Russia, China extensively. We talk the Middle East, Africa, Latin America.
Yeah.
This is the natural transition, I think, of something that's going on all around us, and we probably aren't close enough to.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so right now, focus on space issues at CSIS. I've been there about 2.5 years. Before that, I worked at Amazon on what is now Amazon LEO. It's their broadband constellation in low Earth orbit. I worked at AWS a bit at Amazon, on the Hill a little before that for a member that's since retired. He was from Washington State. I'm from Ohio, though. I don't really know how that worked out, but it was a lot more fun to visit his district on the Olympic Peninsula in the western part of the state than it was where I'm from in southwestern Ohio, just from a scenery standpoint. There's more breweries up there too, back to that as well. And then I was at CIA for about 15 years. My home was always the director of science and technology at CIA, the Culinary Institute of America.
For all our listeners, the director of science and technology, that's where the smart people worked. That's the engineers.
We just liked you to think that, Glenn.
Well,
no, that is a fact. Maybe as we kick off, Clayton, just to set the scene with space, we have not covered this before, so we're very excited. I would just say, is space kind of the Wild West right now of what we should expect? Is there kind of a space battle going on geopolitically, international security-wise?
Yeah, space has always played a big role in national security. Day one, military use of space is really hard to separate from non-military use. The first man-made object in space was actually a V-2 rocket that the Germans were testing in 1944. So that's a long time ago. I think along the way, we've tried to find ways to use it peacefully for science and exploration, but it was always wrapped up into the Cold War, too, with intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so you see that today, too. Space is used for a variety of purposes that both are military and then non-military. What is noteworthy about space, but it's not the only place like this, I think in some ways it looks like cyberspace or maybe the high seas. These are areas that aren't under national jurisdiction. So a lot of things happen there where who's in charge of that? Who says what is right and what's wrong? What are norms for behaviors? So I think that makes it feel like this area that is really ungoverned, but it's really even more ungoverned than the high seas, which we do have an international agreement that dates back to the 1990s on what that looks like in international airspace, and also what you're doing in the ocean. So space doesn't really have as much of an international framework for how it operates as some of these other domains. But again, cyber is a good comparison too, where that one kind of is outside of what we think of, even though it's hard to touch and feel It feels like it's outside of the jurisdiction of a country in a way that maybe something physical that you can hold isn't.
Clayton, has there been any effort internationally to come up with some rules of the road, some kind of international agreement on how space should be further developed or anything?
Yeah, so there's one main treaty. It's the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 that says what you're supposed to do in space. It's not very long. It's only a few pages. And again, I compare that to other domains. The Chicago Convention in the 40s that set up the International Civil Aviation Framework, that's chapters. And then you look at something like the collision regulations at sea, that's a part of another treaty that governs the maritime activities. That's very long as well. You could say in the sea, we've been doing that for centuries, so that wasn't really a new thing. Space is newer, new-ish. So really, since the 60s, though, there's been a few other treaties. A lot of these are really arms control treaties. They're not how do we use space, how do we operate in space. It's more things that originated because the Soviets wanted it and the United States wanted it. And then maybe others signed up for it, but it wasn't really set up in the same way that kind of the rules for these other regions were.
Yeah, if we can draw a line to some of the tactical things that we report on at Restricted Handling around what's going on in Russia, there's been a report over the past 2 weeks that Starlink was taken down, I think, around the 1st of February for Russian forces operating that in Ukraine. And it seems to be fairly debilitating and disruptive to their operations. Now, I don't know, Clayton, if we consider that in the space domain. I think to a layman like myself, that seems like
Yeah,
space
I
and
do.
tactical
Yep.
military but strategic decisions. Can you talk a little bit more about like what does the industry or what are people or experts saying about that and the reliance on something like Starlink?
Yeah, I think it's a good place, Ryan, to maybe just talk about what you might hear someone say is a counter space weapon or counter space capability. That could be anything from a jammer or a spoofer, a jammer for SATCOM, like Starlink, for GPS, spoofing for GPS. So these might affect your ability to use something coming from space. So using a space service, you as someone with a receiver. You could also think of counter space as somebody's launching a missile at a satellite. It's going to blow up the satellite. Or we've heard revelations that Russia could be developing some kind of nuclear weapon that would be in space, an anti-satellite weapon. So something on that far end of the spectrum, which actually that wouldn't be allowed under that outer space treaty that I mentioned. But something that far in, that I call that a counter space weapon as well, just as much as something that is a SATCOM jammer. So another thing interesting here is that you have companies that provide services, Starlink, companies that provide satellite imagery from space that Ukraine could buy, the United States could buy, other countries could buy, and those complement capabilities that a country owns and operates themselves. So since these commercial actors that they are providing service like that is used in conflict, they are increasingly targets. And Russia has said, we're going to consider that just as much as we would consider a government capability that's providing some type of service, military capability. We're going to consider that a target. What's interesting about Starlink, though, is that the Russians, their space program is really built on the Soviet Union. So what they have now, a lot of that has just been kind of deteriorating. It's not something that has been cutting edge for a very long time. It's been not cutting edge. It got treading water. Russia doesn't really have anything like Starlink right now. They don't have broadband constellations. China doesn't really have them yet either. They're launching them now. They're trying to catch up. China has the industrial capacity to do that. Russia doesn't. So Russia's solution here was, well, how do we use Starlink? It's really helping the Ukrainians out. How do we get our hands on some of these terminals? So then it was kind of a cat and mouse game between SpaceX and others who want to defeat that. They don't want the Russians to use that, and then the Russians trying to figure out a way to use that. I think of it in if you had a cell phone, the mobile operator doesn't necessarily know who you are. If you're using that cell phone in an area where there's dozens or hundreds of other users, and they're trying to just say, well, we just don't want these 5 people to use it. We don't want these 10 people to use it. Well, how do you configure that network? How do you make those decisions so that you're just denying those 10 people who you don't really know who they are? They just blend in from everybody else. So that was the situation SpaceX was in when Russians were using these terminals where Ukrainians were. We want the Ukrainians to use them. We don't want the Russians. How do you tell the difference when they're really close together? So that was a problem, which until recently, it sounds like, was an endemic problem. But now SpaceX seems to have a solution. It seems like some of it has to do with how fast the terminal is going. So if it's going so fast in a region, no, we're not letting that get Starlink service. So that was one solution that came up to that kind of thorny issue.
Clayton, what on this issue, I was just in Kiev, and what the Ukrainians are saying is a lot of those terminals were not registered, including on the Ukrainian side, and Starlink just started enforcing registration. So what the Russians were doing, and by the way, the Ukrainians also had some issues, some units, because they were operating off non-registered Starlink terminals. Now, in the case of the Russians, it would seem to me that they really don't have a leg to stand on because they weren't paying for the Starlink. They weren't registered on Starlink. Do you think
Right.
Do you like? I heard one Ukrainian military expert say that it would take the Russians 4 to 6 months to recover from the loss of that capability. What is your assessment? You just said that Russians don't have a Starlink type capability. What do you think?
Yeah. So, I mean, Glenn, you could go into Best Buy or wherever the Gen Z goes these days and go get a Starlink terminal. You don't need to provide them really anything other than a credit card. It's the same thing for buying a prepaid phone. You need to be able to pay for that service. So, Starlink wants you to be able to give them a credit card. But other than that, no. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing either, because you look at some of the benefits of having that being anonymous. You look how powerful that would be in some place like Iran right now, too. So, I just want to point that out. So, Russians took advantage of that. They go buy these terminals off of the Best Buy equivalent in the UAE, for example, and then they take them and they say they activate them in the UAE. They're going to work in Ukraine because a lot of these plans are global roaming plans. So the issue was that it's not that they didn't. They were giving. Obviously, they were paying for it. It was whose name is on that account. It was made up. Essentially, as if I don't know that for sure, but I could guess. So you have that going on. So the issue was that again, how do I, if I don't know who is who, how do I stop that being used? I think your question there about Glenn, what does Russia have if they don't have Starlink? But think about the power of service. And some of these terminals are very small. It might be like the size of this book. Some of the mobile one is very tiny. You could use that anywhere, almost pretty much anywhere in the world. What else is like that? And not that the Russians want to use it anywhere in the world, but if you don't have that capability, what are you left with? I guess you're left with a mobile service somehow that has a SIM card in it. It's using a mobile network. I guess you're left with geostationary satellites, which Russia does have. These are very far away, lower bandwidth. They have higher latency, which means we couldn't be having a call on it right now. It would be very choppy. So it's like night and day. It'd be like going from you have your iPhone to you have your flip phone. So that's what the Russians are going to be faced with now. They don't have Starlink, but they shouldn't have had it in the first place.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's fascinating.
And there's no other competitor now. Like you mentioned, you worked at Amazon, Clayton. Like nobody else has this type of capability out in space.
Yeah. So Amazon is building their constellation. They do have a number of satellites up there. They don't have a retail service yet, so you can't go buy an Amazon Leo terminal. China's building out constellations, no doubt. So we do know that China has sold remote imagery, so that's satellite imagery, I should say, to the non-initiated in the space community, to Wagner Group. They've sold it to the Houthis. Are they selling it to other entities within Russia? Probably. It sounds like China built a satellite to take satellite imagery for the Russians, and it was launched for Russia recently. If China has companies that could provide broadband from low Earth orbit, would they let the Russians buy it? I mean, I'm just looking at the evidence here, and I think all these things the FBI would say were clues, and yeah, they probably would. If they don't have Starlink today, I guess you could say not too far in the distant future, I could see them having something like that from China if China wants to sell that. But I think we also see the danger now that how powerful it is in conflict. It's not just helping people talk. It's piloting drones. It's one-way munitions. It's used to blow things up. So if China wants to get involved in that directly I think that's a little different than what we've seen them do so far. But again, the evidence suggests that they might be willing.
Well, listen, we got Clayton here. He's got a lot of expertise. Aliens. So they're going to release all the UFO files. What do you think?
I just saw those headlines. I'm curious myself. I don't know what that could possibly be, but hey,
Do you
I'll
think?
probably read it, whatever comes out.
Do you think that they'll out me as being an alien?
Hope you're not in those files, Glenn, in any way, shape, or form.
No, I mean, going back to the question of what's happening on the battlefield. That, as you know, and I heard some other podcasts you were on talking about the drone warfare, which is now extensive.
Right.
This does have a serious impact on the ability for command and control to operate these systems. So, and it seems that the Ukrainians have just taken advantage of the Russian problem to take back some of their territory. And I guess, all eyes are out now watching to see what the Russians are going to do to try and recover from this.
And when you've been out there recently, what do you hear? Is Starlink still like the best thing for Ukraine? Do they see that as they did 3 years ago? Is it still pretty much the lifelink, if you will, to get on lifeline, I guess you could say, to be online and to stay connected? And again, not so military too, but civilian. Is it still kind of that critical capability for them?
What's ironic is last year we were there at this time in February, and there was talk that, Starlink was going to turn off its service.
Right.
There was a lot of concern, and there was a lot of kind of scrambling and people looking for alternatives. redundancy. Luckily, that didn't happen, and we won't go into the details of all that. But and now a year later, we were there, and they did this to the Russians, and I was talking to some of the Ukrainians, and they are very thankful for what they have, and they
Yeah.
rely on it extensively because
Yeah.
again, the drone space, the drone warfare, that is dominating the battlefield, and you probably cannot wage war there now without that capability. So yes, the Ukrainians are still very reliant and
Yeah.
very appreciative.
Clayton, beyond Starlink, what are some of the other, like, what are some of the key strategic assets in space today, and where are we headed? And
Mhm.
it can be US. It sounds like the US is quite far ahead, which is
We're
great.
the dominant space power.
That's
Yeah, for
amazing to
sure. Yeah,
hear.
by any metric, right?
So, like, how much of a lead do we have? And then what are some of the other strategic assets that normal people just don't think about in that
Yeah.
capacity out in space?
Yeah, well, I'm an engineer, but I'll put my let's talk about history real quick again, Ryan and Glenn. So humor me. So if you think about really how we use space up until, let's say, 2000, maybe there's some people listening to this podcast who weren't born yet, but it wasn't that long ago. Let me just tell you that. It was a lot when we talk about military use. A lot of it was based on, I guess you could say, the strategic interests, nuclear concerns. How do we do missile warning? How do we do comms to make sure that our ability to command and control our arsenal is survivable? That only started to shift when we look at I think the Gulf War really changed that when it comes to satellite communications. There's a lot of commercial satellite communications used in the Gulf War. It really started to shift though during the War on Terror when a lot of things started to be available commercially, particularly SATCOM. Launch started to change. A lot of this is due to SpaceX and opening up opportunities to just bring down the costs of getting into space. So then you saw more non-government actors in space. That's kind of where we are today. So I think kind of the pillar, though, for where we are with space is really launch. So we have SpaceX has been doing a reusable launch for a long time now. Now we have another American company, Blue Origin, that's done that now. They've proved they can with their New Glenn rocket. China's trying to get that capability too. So this is an area where I think we're going to quickly see China catch up and be able to do reusable launch. Why that matters is because you could turn around a vehicle a lot quicker. You can continue to lower the cost of getting stuff into space. So that means you could put more stuff into space, try out more things, do more experimentation, more innovation and invention. So I think that's kind of a strategic pillar that you see launch, but I think we take it for granted how many launches actually happen. Hundreds worldwide. Most of the vast majority of those are from SpaceX launching their Starlink constellation. So I think other things that we think about comms, that we talked about, Starlink, a lot of other things just are connected through satellites at geostationary orbit. You think about GPS. I think people realize that GPS is really important, and it is. It helps us navigate. It provides timing. There are other ways that timing just is important because a lot of computers just want to know what time it is when things happen. So some like levels of precision are different than other things, but without timing, they start to have problems. And some of them have clocks where it may be days or weeks before they start to have problems. But all of this is eventually going to be a problem if we don't have GPS, and it's not just navigation; it's timing as well. So China has that too. I just want to point that out. So China has their equivalent to that. So does Europe, and so does Russia, actually. So I think that when I think of space, I kind of think these areas have civilian impacts, not just military impacts, if we don't have them. I think they're kind of invisible to us, but these things are always there. And I think a part of our daily lives, we would realize it if we couldn't navigate from point A to point B on our phone.
Ryan, I was thinking when I was younger, like I could go anywhere with a map or,
Right.
learn the streets.
Well,
Now
what
in
was the
my own neighborhood, I
ADC,
get
the map
lost.
book? Or the
What's
map
that?
books? The ADC map books? Is that
Yeah.
what they're called? The big,
Yeah, that's
I
right.
don't know, they're pretty big. You just have one in your car.
Yes.
Now they're
Now,
antiques.
now I can't in my own neighborhood, I get lost without looking at the phone.
Mhm.
So, yes.
But there are
And
places,
I'm sure
just kind of continue on this thread, maybe you guys will find this interesting. So a lot of places around the world have had like continuous interruptions to GPS for years almost at this point. A lot of it is due to Russia. So you see, of course, in Ukraine, but you also see in the Baltic area. And part of me is like, why is Russia just trying to annoy Finland for becoming a NATO member, for example? You see it in the Black Sea. Why? I don't know. I'm blaming Russia for that. You see it in Russia itself. So, Glenn, to your point about threats from drones, in some cases, drones that are navigated by GPS or GLONASS or any kind of global GNSS, global navigation satellite system, you defeat that because you're trying to protect yourself against threats. So if someone's shooting drones at you, you want to jam the GPS so they don't know how to find their targets where you are. So that's why you see it within cities within Russia, but you also see it a lot in the Middle East. And that's the same kind of self-defense that's probably coming from Israel, where they're trying to protect against drone threats from Iran, or maybe not anymore from Hezbollah or Hamas, but they were. At some point in the last 2 years, the most where pilots are reporting this jamming and spoofing, the most affected area was in the Mediterranean. It was Nicosia in Cyprus, in the world. And then occasionally you see it in other places too. But a lot of it is it's a defensive response to you wanting to prevent an enemy from being able to attack you. In addition to these things that I mentioned, it's annoyance. You're trying to annoy someone or cause problems, but these could cause big safety risk for commercial airlines or anyone that's depending on GPS or just even thinks they should be depending on it. Even if they can navigate another way, I think we've grown to like trust it. And that Office episode when I think it was Dwayne was his name. He follows the GPS into a lake. Yeah, I mean, I just think that's
Dwight Schrute.
or Dwight. I'm sorry,
Dwight, yeah. I will say, having been a helicopter pilot and gone through like map reading and navigation while moving fast, not easy. Then we went to inertial navigation systems, which were terrible, to GPS, which was amazing, felt like magic. And I remember the first time I got SATCOM, like the game changer that was in combat when you have mountains that are 14,000 feet tall and you're moving between them. SATCOM was fantastic. So all of this evolution is so interesting.
Right. And it's more bandwidth too. I think that's what we see with Starlink, for example. So everything is data hungry, pushing data and sending data, and everything is so sensor based. And that just creates a lot of information that has to move around. A lot of this too, it's not just that the capabilities in space are increasing in a vacuum. They're increasing because of demand in other areas that are all part of the same, I guess you could say, warfare in the information age or in the fourth industrial revolution. It's just a very data-centric way that we do war.
When we read about space, we hear that it's congested with all of what's going on. But then when we see pictures, it's wide open, obviously. How would you advise people to think of that?
Well, I read something. I think it was Ohio, so that's where I'm from. It was like there were two cars in Ohio. This could be apocryphal, so just keep that in mind. Two cars in Ohio, the first two cars, they managed to hit each other. I'm like, yeah, I mean, that doesn't surprise me. But then someone else said, okay, if you had like 8 ants and then you had the state of Rhode Island, that's like low Earth orbit. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's a lot of space. So I guess, what I think we miss, though, is that the speeds are it's like 17,000 miles per hour when you're in low Earth orbit. It's very fast. Things can happen very quickly. Yeah, and you can only track debris a certain size. So there are things that are in space that maybe you can't track, so you don't even know are there. I don't know if you saw in the news, it was probably 2 months ago, there was at China's space station, they had a crewed capsule that suffered some kind of damage with the windshield, essentially. It's something that hit it. And the thought was that it was debris, non-trackable debris, a couple centimeters, but moving 1,000 miles per hour, and that they had to get another capsule to get the crew back. So something like that can happen, even though it's the 8 ants in Rhode Island. But like I said, 2 cars in Ohio and they hit each other. What I think we should think about, though, is that there's how do I say this? Like how we track things in space is really interesting. And if this is boring, just stop me. But when you think about low Earth orbit, you think of these things moving 17,000 miles per hour. It's really just like physics where they're not really expending a bunch of energy to move. It's just essentially gravity pulling them down, and they're already moving fast enough because there's little drag that they're just, as they're falling towards Earth, that's the orbit. So you're always falling, but you're always going around in a very predictable trajectory. So when a radar that's tracking an object in space, satellite or something that's just a rocket body or even something that is natural, like, I guess you could say if that's stupid, it wouldn't be an orbit. It would have to be, it's probably a man-made object. But if it's tracking it, it's really just tracking it when it goes over like a fan. So imagine a radar, it's just a fan into space, and then the object goes through the fan. Aha, it was object A. And then object A, I expect to go over my other radar. And when it goes there and I saw it there, aha, it's object A again. So I track it very intermittently. It's not like when you think of the airplane on approach at the airport. I got, the radar, it's spinning, it's getting it, it's hitting it, airplane. No, it's like satellite, hours. There it is again. More hour. There it is again. This is low Earth orbit. So you do have the potential when satellites are very maneuverable or they're maneuvering around that you don't it creates a lot of uncertainty and risk. So you kind of have this area where you actually don't know precisely where that satellite is, and that's where the risk comes about. That you don't always exactly know where it is. So when two of these areas where we don't quite exactly know where they are almost get near each other, we think they will in the future. You have all of these possibilities for collisions. It doesn't mean there's going to be a collision, but you have to think about how you would handle that scenario. Do you both go left? Because when you're walking down the street and you make eye contact with someone, you know how that is. It's like, oh, yeah. And then all of a sudden you've run into each other. So you just kind of have to think these things out. This goes to like how there's a need for norms, which we do have for collision regulations at sea that ships are supposed to follow. And that's part of a treaty, but it's also just part of the history of being a seafaring power.
Mhm.
We just don't have that for space. So for all I know, that you have that probability of a collision. That where's the satellite? It's a Chinese satellite, and it's the U.S. satellite that we're overlapping, and we're like, well, who do we call? I don't even know. And if the satellite, if that one goes left and we go right, we could hit each other, and it's happened. Even though, again, my cars hitting each other in Ohio, that's happened in space. There have been satellite collisions.
Is there a hotline where, governments can call and say your satellite is getting very close to our satellite, or like we're tracking this and in 3 months there's going to be a collision, we need to do something?
It depends on what the country is, really, and it depends on the operators. SpaceX, a company that has 9,000 satellites, they had to figure this out. They have to figure this out somehow. How does that work? I don't know, but they have the vast majority of their satellites right now. They have that issue that I talked about of the possibility of a collision. It's basically a probability. So at a certain level of probability, you have to decide, what do I do? It could be projected in the future. Tomorrow, you might have a collision. What do I do? An hour, you might have a collision. What do I do? That's times 9,000. So that's how these constellation operators have to think. So I think, Ryan, going back to your question, when we think about congestion in space, that's kind of what it looks like. It's not so dense that you're like this on the metro
Yeah.
or the subway. It's that we're projecting out into the future when we're thinking, when things we don't quite know exactly where that object is right now, we're projecting in the future, we might get close enough where we should be worried that we could have a collision. What do we do? That's what the congestion means.
Can we change gears a little bit? The space exploration, Clayton, like
moon.
Mars, moon, the
Yeah.
moon. You talk about rare earth minerals that some
Yeah.
people speculate.
They got them on the moon, Glenn. They got them on the moon.
How are we doing there, like the U.S.? Because there was a lot of talk that NASA's budget was being cut.
Yeah.
Cuts in national programs. What's your assessment? Are we in the good place in terms of exploration, or are we being outpaced by our competitors?
Yeah. So China, they want to land humans on the moon by 2030. They've said that for a while now. We want to land them before that. Now I think we're shooting for somewhere like 2028. We've got a rocket on the launch pad right now at Kennedy Space Center. It's getting impatient. It's going to send astronauts around the moon. It will be the furthest humans have ever gone from Earth. The orbit is further than the on the Apollo mission. They're not going to land. They're just going to go around. This is Artemis 2. China's not even close to doing that right now, but they are methodically, baby step, getting to where they would be ready to do a crewed lunar mission. So we're ahead right now. If there is a race to get us back to the moon, but we've already been there, and them there for the first time. Current administration seems pretty committed to that, to trying to make sure we get there before China. They seem to be very committed to Artemis, which is a long-term vision for being on the moon. It's not just let's send people there and then come back and we'll forget about it for 50 years, kind of like that was Apollo. It also is a stepping stone for Mars, but it's an important stepping stone. Just if you look at the map, if you will, the moon is a very strategic location for stuff. If we ever go in the solar system and beyond, it's a natural, you could say, toll plaza, or not a toll plaza, a rest area that will serve value. It also has resources, Glenn, though. You're right about that.
It's going to be a toll plaza, but yes.
Yeah, free one. Yeah. But so like there's the exploration piece here, but there's also strategic value to the moon. And I don't think we quite know what that is. It's maybe not possible to determine yet, but it's the same thing that did Thomas Jefferson know what was in the West when he sent Lewis and Clark? I mean, we just had a hunch. So I think a lot of us have the same hunch about the moon and beyond, that there is a strategic value there, but I can't give you this is the value yet. I can't tell you how much it's worth.
Right.
I think we're good. We just have to we can't stop. We can't let our foot off the pedal. We can't just jog. We got to run because China's running.
I have one more question about the space exploration. I heard you say in a podcast that it would take a year to get to Mars and 3 years to get back.
Yeah, and that's on it's a little less than a year if you do the where everything is aligned right to make it the quickest. But if you think about, I mean, it could be Mars could be way over there. We could be way over here. So it's really just depends on timing. And there's certain windows about, I think it's every 2 years ish for the best Mars window. So I think there's one in 2026. I think the next one's in 2028. You can go to Mars anytime you want. It's just going to be a lot longer journey.
So my real question, Clayton, was for those of us that work for the government, you think that would be approval for business class if it's 1 year and get there?
Man,
Or do you
yeah.
think that
That'd be a rough if you're in business class. Even if it's Etihad, it's going to be that's going to be a rough flight. That's for
the
sure.
middle seat economy?
Yeah, the middle seat coach. Maybe you can get economy plus.
Yeah, only on the
Yeah,
way
economy
back.
plus.
The 3 year flight you could probably get, but you're probably economy on the
That's
1 year.
right.
Yeah.
What? It's 364 days, so you don't meet the threshold.
Right. Well, I mean, now they got that premium economy. They didn't really have that when I was in government. I don't really know who gets that now. It's the quasi business, the business
Mhm.
light. Maybe you get that.
Going back to one of Glenn's earlier questions about norms and treaties, just given how fractured the international community is right now, especially when the three dominant players here
Yeah.
are Russia, China, and us,
Yep.
do you feel that's a risk? I guess, number one, do you think that there's hope that we can work this out in space?
Yeah.
And if not, like, how big of a risk is that?
Yeah, like in some ways though, Ryan, like Russia just doesn't matter in space. I can't speak to Russia in other domains, if you will, but I'd have to look at the numbers for how many rockets they launched last year, but it's probably less than 20. It's probably like 15. Whereas China was probably like 80 and the US is probably like 160. Most of those are from SpaceX, but it's just like what? I mean, I think they had an issue with their launch pad that they used to get humans to the International Space Station. That was damaged. So there's a question of whether or not they can even continue to do that. They talk a lot about future missions to the moon. I don't see how that's possible at all. I just really don't. And they talk about being a partner with China on things like moon related projects. I just don't see it. I just don't see the industrial capacity to do that. Which is a shame though, because they had historically been a reliable partner with the United States and others on the International Space Station. I think that is a great story of international collaboration that started really going back to the Cold War with Apollo Soyuz in 1975. So this to me shows how even if you're adversaries, you can do things together that add value to humanity. So that's a glimmer of hope, but that's a long way just to me to say it's really just China and the United States right now. Europe is active in space. Japan is active in space. Other places want to be active in space. But if you just look at kind of the volume and the money involved in it, it's really China and companies, if you want to call them companies in China, and US government, and then companies in the US that are really dominating. So part of me just thinks is there a way to find some type of understanding so that things happen safely in space. Maybe it starts on the moon because China is doing a lot on the moon, like we talked about. The US would be doing a lot on the moon. Can it happen somewhere else in orbit? Maybe it's focused on companies operating these large constellations like SpaceX and Amazon and Chinese companies. So it could be driven by commercial interests. I don't know. I feel like the trust is so low that I just have a hard
Yeah.
time seeing it. And just kind of a few other things to think about here. So back to other agreements. You look at, so yeah, I mentioned 1940s. That was the agreement on aviation. The U.S. said, "Hey, we're going to get everybody together in Chicago. We're going to do this," and that was pretty much right at the end of World War II. We could do that then, and everyone came. And the Soviets were our allies then. Obviously, things are different now. You look at kind of the history of the equivalent for the sea, maritime, that developed over time, and that ended in a treaty that also covered exploiting resources on the seafloor. We didn't sign that treaty. I just want to point that out. We didn't ratify that treaty. The U.S. didn't, even though we say we adhere to its provisions. This is a similar issue, though, with space. When you talk about, Glenn, to your point about the moon, and I think both of your points about rare earths, there's a lot of resources in space that it kind of is going to be hard to figure out how we're going to play nicely within the limited way that this is addressed in the Outer Space Treaty. The U.S. says you can mine resources on the moon, but I think the issue is if there's a very attractive mine for whatever helium-3. This is something people talk about in the lunar regolith. It's called the surface oil, and the U.S. wants it, and China wants it. I don't know who wins. That just gets ugly really quick in my mind because there's no way to sort that out. But this was foreseen again with seafloor resources, and I think we could see it now with the moon. And I think the model for the seafloor, that's a whole nother podcast. I don't think that's going to work on the moon. We just can't. It's the issue of like having jurisdiction to have property rights, and you can't right now under some of these treaties. So it's creating an area where you're going to have commercial interests that just don't they're not going to be able to sort it out on their own. And this is another area where I just don't know if I see the trust to really have some type way to get out of this pickle. The military side of it is it's there, but that's not as pressing to me because if we're going to go to the moon and do things at scale, it's probably not a military base. It's probably civilian. It's probably commercial, and China's probably thinking the same way. So that's where you're going to have the kind of the heads butt. And again, it's just very flimsy right now when we look to the Outer Space Treaty on how to handle some of these things.
Are there other players? You mentioned China, the U.S., of course, but the Europeans, I know the Turks talk about they're going to put be in space. They have
I
a
think
space.
they have a moon project. Yeah.
Brazil, I hear every once in a while, right? I mean, are they just places where launches are going to happen, or they're actually building and launching satellites and
Yeah, a lot of these countries, they don't have launch, so they don't have their own sovereign launch capability. A lot of them want it, and are trying to build it. I don't know how many space launch sites we need. I'll just put that out there right now, but it's kind of a prestige project too. So I get it, and it's something that you also might say you just want to be able to do that on your own and not have to rely on someone else. When it comes to the science and the exploration and the missions, I think a lot of it is their science, and there's a lot of value to that too. But it is really just I've kind of graduated to the club of spacefaring nations, or I've graduated to the club of nations that have sent something to the moon or even to Mars. The UAE sent a mission to Mars a few years ago. So there's countries that have, I think, the some level of expertise in science and engineering, and then they have the money. Yeah, I get it that they want to do space. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do launch. They might pay SpaceX to launch it or do a ride share, is what they call it sometimes. You may see a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket go up, and believe it or not, it has like 50 satellites on it. And some of them aren't very big. Some of them might be the size of a small, college refrigerator, or dorm refrigerator. Some may be a little bigger, but some may be even smaller than that. So there's a lot of opportunity. You could say that the space has been democratized to a certain degree, but it doesn't mean you have your own launch in your country. It just means you have access to buy a seat on the bus, and that gets you into orbit or that gets you to the moon. But yeah, I do think you're right, Glenn. You do see that with a lot of countries interested in doing that these days.
Clayton, just before we get you out, would you mind if I hit you with 5 rapid fire questions?
Let's do
All right. What is the US's biggest vulnerability in the space domain?
GPS. Reliance on GPS for so many different things, civil and military and commercial, and it can be jammed.
What's one capability that really keeps you up at night when we talk about space?
I think when it comes down to like the doctrine of how certain weapons are used, I guess I worry. I don't know if but I would only know the open source side of this. Do we know when China would use some of its what I call counter space weapons to say, let's say, launch a missile at a satellite in space? Under what circumstances would they use that? I don't know I don't feel like that's really clear. There's so much we don't know about how China would fight a full-blown conflict. So that keeps me up at night, that we just don't know.
Interesting. What's one thing the public is way too relaxed about when it comes to space, or paranoid about? Take it either direction.
I think it's hard sometimes to sell the value of something like Artemis or going to the moon or going beyond that, or just science in space. Maybe that it's viewed as just something not critical, but I would just say there is strategic value that I mentioned. And then also anytime we're doing research and science and things that are kind of you don't see the product or service right away, but it's like it's required. I view it as like kind of the necessary fuel that then powers inventions and innovation. And that's what our economy is built on. So I think when we think about science and we're like, well, why would I pay for that? Well, I'm like, that's because it's like one step on the way towards these awesome things that we use in our daily lives. I just don't think we realize that. And I just want to point out, like, a company doesn't usually want to pay for that because it's too risky. And the only person paying for science is usually the government.
Last one. Have you heard Glenn ever play his Russian banjo guitar?
No.
What's
Are we
it
doing
called,
that now?
Glenn? What's it called?
Called the balalaika.
That's it.
Well, yeah, I don't think I've heard you play it.
Balalaika.
I'm glad it was sitting right there. What else is I can't see?
That's because before each podcast, I warm up with a couple of ditties.
Nice. All right. Sweet.
I do have a question. Are we preparing Americans to continue in the space field? Do we give them the hard sciences?
Yeah.
What's your
I do
assessment?
worry about that. Yeah, I do worry. I think a lot of it is, and I get it. It is a hard sell. Why should we invest in science and basic research and development as a government? I guess I look at universities as a lot of that basic science and research right now. That's coming from universities, and a lot of that money comes from the government. So I worry if that like even if we just slightly turn that spigot off, maybe we won't even see the impact in our lifetimes. But I think our children might for sure, because it's like it's the seed, and then all this stuff grows out of it. So I don't think China is making this mistake. I guess I just feel like you see a lot of focus on that. And a lot of the things that their satellites are doing, kind of back to our broader discussion. We don't even know if they are sometimes. It's all these test satellites. They're doing all these crazy things, crazy maneuvers in space. They're moving around. They call it rendezvous proximity operations, testing stuff out in different orbits. And people are like, well, why? And a lot of it's just like, well, they're just trying stuff out. They're just spending money to experiment. And I don't think we do that. And that relates, I think, to this question about, well, where's the workforce that's able to do that? Right now, it's really concentrated at SpaceX, which is great, and they're doing a lot. But it's a business focus right now, and it's a focus that is not necessarily always there when you're looking at basic research and development and science. So to me, I worry that we're not prioritizing that enough. I don't think a company should have to do that. It's too risky for a company. It's unfortunately it falls on the government, but I think that a lot of it has to be that people see the value and they want that. I think that's it's a tough sell, but I feel like it's a case that we should make.
The Space Force, overhyped, underhyped, adequate for what we need right now in the future?
Yeah, it's we need to really think about what our national space power, our national military space power should look like. Space Force set up over 5 years ago now. A lot of how we look at space looks very similar to what we did in the 70s and the 80s and during the Cold War. I think things like Golden Dome and the space-based interceptors try to get us out of that mold a little bit and think very creatively about, well, what are all the tools of space power that we can apply to the military and to our national security? I think this is the direction Space Force is trying to go. Of course, budgets are limited. So this is kind of back also to this point about research and development and experimenting and trying things out. But there's a lot of stuff that Space Force does so well. We just depend on it. We just need to make sure they have a budget and they have that inspiration really to think outside the box there too. So they're thinking about, well, there's a Henry Ford quote, again, probably apocryphal, and maybe I'll just end on this. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So I don't think we should just ask Space Force for the faster horses. We should make sure we're letting them invent the car.
Thank you so much, Clayton. Glenn, you want to wrap us up here?
Well, I just want to say thank you, Clayton, and
Thanks for the invite. It was a great discussion.
great weekend, and congratulations, Clayton, on finishing some of the work on your country home.
Right.
You and your family have a nice weekend there, maybe.
We actually have Starlink there, back to the space conversation, because otherwise we wouldn't have internet. We wouldn't have internet. It's registered. It's got my name on it. Yeah, they could track me. If they want to shut mine down, they can. They know where I live, literally.
Don't do it, though. Don't do it.
Yeah, no, it's great. Great.
I already want to ask, like, is it true you can just, because this is how out of touch I am, you can just go to like Best Buy and buy a Starlink terminal?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, I don't know if yours will have it, but yeah, I've seen them. Yeah, we got ours. We just ordered it, but yeah.
Amazing. How about you, Ryan? You have a Starlink in the...
No, this is one of the things that surprised me when I read about what was going on in Russia and Ukraine is when I've looked at it maybe 2 years ago to purchase, like you need a small satellite. It used to be like that you mount somewhere.
Yeah, you do. Yep.
But I don't know if now, like when they talk about putting them on a UAV that's moving like 80 knots, do you still need that? Or is it, like
Nope,
most things?
you need it. Or the
Okay.
one, like I said, there was that book that I held up. So not to get too technical, it is electronically steering the beam. So it is an antenna that is moving. Obviously, you don't see this. This is the radios, if you will. And it's moving it around to find the best connection to the best satellite, which it could see tens of satellites, for example, if not more. But think about your cell phone is trying to find the best connection with the tower. This is what this antenna is doing. It's moving, but it's flat. It's not like a parabolic dish that it's pointed in one direction all the time and you have to physically move it. This one, or even like a radar where you see at the airport and it's spinning around. Literally, it's moving it. It's doing that by changing, and this is where it's way too technical for me, but changing the characteristics of like many, many, many different arrays or antennas within that bigger array, and that's what moves the beam. And it's always doing that all the time. That actually is why it's difficult to jam as well. So it's kind of it doesn't matter how fast you're moving, because like I told you how fast those satellites are moving anyway in space. So like if it's on an airplane, the airplane's moving 500 miles per hour, that's like lost in the noise of the 17,000 mile per hour satellite moving in space.
Next time we meet, maybe it's at Sources and Methods somewhere in Arlington.
Right.
Give
me a few years though for that. But yeah.
All right. Hopefully it's before that then. All right. Thank you very much, Clayton. This was a blast. Exactly what we were looking for. And
Good.
more.
Okay, good. Yeah,
Thank
for me too.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening and being a part of the RH community. Would you like to receive the same daily intel brief that Glenn and I read? You can get it at restrictedhandling.com. We've curated what we consider to be the most relevant and reputable sources on all things international security, geopolitics, military and intel ops, and economics and sanctions, focused exclusively on Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and the Middle East, to include accompanying podcasts for Russia, China, economics, and spy stories. Just head to restrictedhandling.com, enter your email, and you'll get the daily briefs that Glenn and I both read, and you can leave comments and questions that we can respond to. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe.